From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melithopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. A few episodes back, we had a fascinating show with Josh Flash from the Oregon Department of Agriculture talking about the importance of keeping invasive arthropods out of Oregon as a way to improve pollinator health. And one of the things that he mentioned was keeping exotic bees out of the state. Now, there hasn't been a lot of data sort of looking at the association of the growth of an establishment of some of these exotic bees on native bee communities until recently. You may have heard in the news there was a fascinating study done in Virginia and Maryland tracking mason bees, exotic mason bees, and the associated changes in some of the native bee communities. And I'm so pleased today to bring the author of that study to talk to you. Kate LeCroy is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, working out of the Rolliston Lab, and it's a fascinating episode in terms of how you bring such data sets to bear on problems like this and some of the challenges of using data to make these kinds of interpretations of impact. It's also fascinating because it's the first episode we've ever had that includes a Dolly Parton playlist. So you won't want to miss this episode. The other thing to point out is that Kate is going to be talking this year at the annual Orchard Bee Association meeting, one of the best meetings that I attend every year. It's going to be on Friday, December 11th, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. You can register at the Orchard Bee Association meeting. There are going to be some fantastic speakers there, but also just a chance to stay in touch with what's going on in the orchard bee world. OrchardBee.org. Register today, and without further ado, here's Kate LeCroy talking about exotic mason bees today on Pollination. Okay, well, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome to Pollination.
Yes, thank you for having me, Anthony.
You know, lots of gardeners and orchardists have talked about cultivating mason bees. We've had lots of shows on cultivating mason bees. Can you tell us a little bit about the genus Osmia, particularly in the species that you have in Virginia and Maryland where you did your research?
Yeah, certainly. Mason bees are, in my opinion, and hopefully yours, they're really cool. And mason bees are the genus Osmia, and they usually nest in hollow cavities found in nature. So that could be little rocky crevices and outcrops or abandoned insect burrows from beetles or other ground nesting bees. They nest in snail shells or pine cones and even in rolled up newspapers. If you build it, they will come. And they earn their name Mason Bee not by joining a secret society, but by using materials like mud or chewed up leaves to make little walls inside their nest. And we've got around 20 or so Mason bee species in Virginia. And some of those are native. Most of them are native, but we also have some exotic Mason bees in Virginia, including Osmia cornifrons and Osmia taurus.
Well, before we get into the exotic bees, I often think of mason bees as being bees that fly in the spring, orchard. Is that necessarily the case with the Osmia fauna that you have in up there in the Northeast?
Good question. So a number of our mason bees do emerge in the spring. We do have some that are active in the later summer seasons. I think my favorite pollinator species, Osmia texana, is active later in the summer around July.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I guess let's get back to you mentioned that there are some, a number of species that are native, but that some were exotic. Can you explain who these exotic mason bees are and how they got to your region, and maybe this larger issue of, how these bees are getting moved around the world?
Yeah, certainly. So with mason bees, some mason bees have a history of being studied and managed for orchard pollination. And some mason bee species are introduced to areas where they didn't previously exist. In fact, most bee species, of all the bee species, most bee species that we know of are introduced to North America. They're all cavity nesting bees, so including mason bees. And 2 mason bee species introduced from Asia have recently naturalized in the region. And the Japanese hornface bee is Osmia cornifrons, and that's a mason bee that was intentionally introduced from Japan by the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. And it was introduced in the 1970s for crop pollination services, such as for tree apple orchards. Yes, in 2002, another mason bee from Asia, Osmia taurus, was first documented in the United States. And we first found it in West Virginia, and we don't know how it got here. There's no record of it being intentionally imported. We know that most bee species that are introduced intentionally or unintentionally are cavity nesting bees that are introduced in North America. They often come nesting inside cargo unsuspectingly or in lumber for furniture making. But this is how oftentimes species are introduced, either intentionally or unintentionally.
You know, we had an episode a while back where someone was describing alfalfa leaf cutting bees and the way that they were brought over, and they seemed to have been introduced accidentally, but then somebody figured out they were getting high yields for alfalfa seed crops, and then they started to cultivate them. So sometimes it's been going on for a while. That's back in the 50s at least when that occurred.
Yeah. Jim Kane and Teresa Pitt-Singer have such a cool article about alfalfa leaf cutting bees. It
is a great article, and it really is one of those species that, both there was research on it, but there's such a kind of grassroots sort of taking up of the bee, and it is a fascinating story, the whole cultivation. But I guess, when it comes, and so I guess that's one example where people will say, oh, the introduction, and I imagine when these, in the first case with cornifrons, it was introduced specifically for the purpose of pollination. But in many cases, these bees are just coming in. They're just every year, another one's landing and it takes off. And I guess, I haven't seen a lot of research, looking at the effects of these, introduced bees on closely related native species. Can you explain how you kind of came to this research question and how you were able even to ask the question about these negative impacts when I imagine the impacts happen over a span of a decade or so, and you're doing your PhD work. So how were you able to even approach this question?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. And really figuring out if one bee has a impact, be that positive or negative, on another bee is so hard to measure, in part because bees move around really fast. So documenting any kind of competition among bees is really hard compared to, say, plants and competition. But I always find myself wanting to look at patterns and confirming patterns before I start thinking about what produces the patterns. So I guess when I really wanted for my PhD was to find and confirm patterns about bee decline, because it's really sparse. The literature is really sparse when you're looking at impacts of exotic bees on native bees or introduced bees on native bees. It's pretty sparse. But in my place, I wanted to find a pattern first that held true, and then start elucidating any mechanism that might produce that pattern or that could be responsible for producing that pattern.
Okay, that's great. I can see, and I can understand how, that first point you made about how difficult it is to track these patterns, because the patterns will take place over a long period of time, and it's not the bees are flying around, and they also, I know with wild bee communities, they go up and down. 1 year they're good, 1 year they're not. It's not like a managed species that sort of you're trying to maintain at a steady level over time. So how on earth were you able to measure this impact, which would take a lot of area and a lot of years? How did you manage to even ask this question in PhD?
Yeah, so I am very lucky in terms of standing on the shoulders of giants. There have been a lot of collection efforts and efforts to track changes so far in the region I was interested in, which is the Mid-Atlantic United States. So that includes West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, as well as Washington, D.C. And there have been records of where these mason bees are and how frequently they were captured in a given area. And a good opportunity to look at that change over time could be using data from pan traps. And pan traps in the Mid-Atlantic, they've been used to catch lots of flying insects attracted to these colorful plastic bowls or cups. And they're essentially plastic bowls filled with some kind of preservative solution or soapy water to catch the flying insects. These insects will die in the solution, and a collector scoops them out of the bowl to clean and identify the insects that they're interested in. And there's been some pretty frequent pan trapping activity throughout the Mid-Atlantic United States since the early 2000s, especially in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and West Virginia. A lot of those efforts have been coordinated by Sam Droege at the U.S. Geological Survey. And he has this wonderful community of volunteers and citizen science participants all over these states. Sam's pan trapping data set continues up to today. So I think the earliest records might be in 1999 when I was 9 years old. And he's still going. He's still, getting a whole community involved in monitoring these bees.
A funny anecdote is when Sam came for a holiday in Oregon, he brought pan traps with him. And then it had to be like 3 or 4 months later, I got these pizza boxes full of pinned and labeled bees. I was like, holy smokes, how did you do that?
Oh, yeah, he's notorious for his Little Caesars pizza boxes of bees. And he'll give them to seventh graders and grandparents, and he doesn't keep them roped up in museums. You aren't able, for everybody who's unable to go back into the back of a museum collection. He gives these pizza boxes out to classrooms and everyone. So it's really bringing the bees to everybody. I love it.
But I guess before those pizza boxes go out to everybody, that data is collected and captured. And so there is this years of data that has been captured. So anytime an Osmia species sort of flew by one of these traps and landed, it got captured in a data set. And I guess that's what you had. You had data sets from across the region. I guess they weren't specifically looking for Osmia, but Osmia were landing in them.
Yes, exactly, Anthony. So we utilized Sam Droege's data set where they cleaned and pinned and identified those bee species. And there were a lot of other bees and wasps that were in those pan traps that are not just mason bees or not just Osmia. So another great data set I utilized was from Grace Savoy-Burke and Deborah Delaney at University of Delaware. Grace and Deborah coordinated an extensive pan trapping project in the same general region in 2014 and 2015. And I also conducted a citizen science program with folks doing pan trapping all over Virginia in 2017 and 2019.
Well, I really love that idea as well. Just in terms of when people do these kinds of surveys, they can be used years later for all sorts of questions. Just getting the infrastructure in for doing the surveys can be so helpful years later when somebody has a really good question to ask of it.
Yeah, these pan traps, they caught all kinds of bees and wasps. And to be completely clear, not everybody who's probably no one was putting out these pan traps thinking exactly, oh, how are the mason bees changing and how often I catch them. So there were plenty of variation in how people put out these pan traps. For instance, let's say they're in West Virginia and they set out perhaps 15 bowls, and they'd leave these bowls out for 2 days. So that's a sampling event in West Virginia that used 15 bowls for 2 days, and they collected a certain number of bees. We would just pull the data for mason bees and look at that. But let's say there's another sampling event that's in Delaware, and they put out 9 bowls, not 15, and they leave them out for 7 days instead of 2 days. And then another person in Maryland just set out 50 bowls for 1 day. And on that day, there was really bad weather. So how do you standardize what they did? And how do you make conclusions, especially year to year? It's really hard. It's not a trivial problem.
Can you tell us a little bit, because you in the paper that was recently published on your work, you describe how you were able to deal with these inconsistencies, which is really fascinating because I imagine other researchers have the same issue of taking these data sets and trying to sort of pull them together so that they can make them meaningful. Tell us a little bit about the steps that you took.
Right. So it's definitely not a trivial problem, and we wrangled a lot of data. So one way we did this was, filtering out sampling events, perhaps that noted bad weather. So bad weather events could be a reason why you don't see a certain bee, not because it wasn't there, but because the bad weather prevented bad flying conditions. And we also filtered out events that didn't use all 3 colors of the standard bowl colors for pan trapping. So they had to use blue bowls, yellow bowls, and white bowls. And there were lots of sampling events that only used 1 or 2 of the colors. And some records didn't even have the notes about what colors were used.
Oh, and I suppose the reason that's significant is that the bees may have a bias towards a certain color. So if you only had yellow ones, it might skew the results slightly.
Right. There may be certain groups of bees that are more attracted to certain colors, and it's generally figured out that across all times of the day, the color's attractiveness can change given what color it is. So they know that blue, yellow, and white are a generally fail-safe combination to get as many bees that would come to pan traps that will.
Okay, so you filtered those out, and you filtered out this. You looked at the notes, and this is a bad weather day. That doesn't represent.
Yeah, and they're about overall. If they didn't use, there are about 350 of the sampling events that didn't use the right colors, and that was about 3,000 mason bee specimen records we couldn't use in the analysis.
So I remember reading in the paper at this fascinating situation where you had one trap that had just an inordinate number of one species in it that you had to filter out because it was just so unusual.
That was bizarre. There were, 550 or so mason bees in a single day. And the next largest event was a 35-day catch that had significant, maybe 80 specimen records. So it was a lot. It was just very unusual. So we left that one out, but we did run the analysis with it and put it as a supplementary analysis to show that it didn't change for that particularly weird event.
So how many bees in total, and how many? So this was 15 years of data. 15 years. Yes. When you brought it together, and how many bees are we talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about around 6,000 specimens of mason bees and over about 1,100 sampling events.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's take a quick break. I want to leave us on a cliffhanger. It's like, hey, if you want to know what happens next, join us after the break. So let's take a quick break, and we'll regroup and find out what you found in all those 15 years of data with these mason bees in Virginia and Maryland. Okay, we're back. At the break, I always love the breaks because we get a chance to debrief a little bit. And one of the things that we didn't talk about in terms of making the data set fit was not just whether the traps are the same color or bad days or kicking out these extraordinary bee catch events, but also other factors. Can you walk us through some of the other things that go into taking a data set like that and making it into something that's apples and apples?
Yes, Anthony. Yes, that is really important to have some amount of data that you can compare more as equally as possible or as best as you can. So one thing was that sampling events did not have the same number of bowls put out in each sampling event. Some they set out 5 bowls for their pan trapping. Others might set out 50 bowls. And so how do you account for differences in number of bees that way? And there's also the number of days that they set out these pan traps. Some will be just for a day. Others will be for 15 days. So how do you standardize these different data? And the way we did that was standardizing it in our statistical analysis, where we multiplied the number of days and the number of bowls and created bowl days and created that is what we're calling an offset variable in our analysis. And the other element was space. So the Mid-Atlantic is a large swath of space. It's not just one field station worth a plot to look at bees over time. And that has exciting context to make conclusions about a larger area, but it's also more difficult to say that you're able to document this over time significantly.
Well, I know people are familiar. We've had Rich Hatfield on from Xerces doing the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, where they've gridded out the state and kind of evened out the sample effort. But I imagine when you have a historic data set, you can't do that. You're sort of opportunistically picking data where somebody ran a study. So how do you standardize?
Yes. So we worked really hard pre-analysis and post-analysis to make sure we accounted as best as possible for spatial variation and spatial, what we call autocorrelation. And any spatial structure left in the analysis could give us concern that our estimates are not valid, or that there could be problems in interpreting them. So we utilized a clustering strategy, and it was based on the estimated foraging distances of mason bees. And so if these sampling events were very close to each other within the foraging distance of a mason bee, we clustered them. And sampling events that were in the same year, we pooled all of their records data together, and we added their bowl days.
Oh, great, because I guess the issue is you could inflate. You have a bunch of bowls that are very close together, and then it looks, it gets very inflated because there's just so much sampling activity there. But rather, you could say, well, they're kind of the same unit of area because the bees are in those bowls are could be from the same nest or something, and so then you just kind of make it a unit together.
Yeah. So if there's a lot of sampling events around Baltimore, Maryland, spoiler alert, there were. So we're going to cluster those. We're going to pool those data so that we don't get just tons and tons of. So
Baltimore dominates the data set.
Yeah. So we don't want that to happen.
Gotcha.
So we cluster those sites and standardize it that way.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. That was a little. We teased that we were going to get into the results, but we're really going to get into the results now. So what did you find? Were these exotic bees having a negative impact on the native mason bees that were there?
Yeah. So what is interesting to me is that in this study, I didn't find any causal linkages of one exotic bee impacting a native bee. But what I did find were interesting patterns. And we found that in the mid-Atlantic, we were able to analyze 8 mason bee species. 6 of those mason bees are native species, and 2 are the exotic, cornifrons and taurus. And we found that all 6 of the native mason bee species that we caught were, on average, caught less and less every year in their raw numbers, and significantly so. At the same time, in those 15 years, one of the exotic mason bee species, Osmia taurus, is soaring in the number caught in pan traps on average each year. So the other exotic species, Osmia cornifrons, doesn't seem to be changing in abundance in these pan traps year to year.
Okay, so a lot of the native species are doing poor, or there's less of them showing up in the traps every year. What kind of magnitude are you seeing? What's the extent of the?
Our native species were declining anywhere from about 9% to 16% per year in abundance. And that would mean, if you think of a cumulative loss of bees since 2003, that would be a native species. All native species, their cumulative loss ranged from like 76% to 91% since 2003.
Oh, that's really dramatic. That's a really interesting finding. You also mentioned you had 2 exotic species. So cornifrons wasn't in decline, so it wasn't, but it was holding steady. But you said that the second exotic species really grew. What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so it was about a 16% increase per year on average in our pan traps. And if you were to think about that as a cumulative increase, it would be an 800% jump since 2003 in abundance in pan traps.
So that's really remarkable. It's the first finding of that kind that I've ever encountered. So it's really useful information. Do you have? You mentioned earlier that you can document descriptively that this is going on, but the causation, that wasn't really the scope of the study. Can you? What kind of what questions rise in your mind in terms of like what might be causing this and what might be sort of driving these changes?
Yes, I think that's really important, and that a pattern like this it brings back the importance of talking about bee decline. When we talk about bee decline, we often fail to tease apart winners and losers, and that's an important distinction to make when we're trying to save the bees.
Oh, I guess what you mean, like winners and losers, that some species may proliferate and some may decline, and that, when you talk about decline across the board, it doesn't capture that level of kind of detail, which is important.
Yes, exactly. And I think the factors that could be driving the patterns we're seeing there are a few, but I'm excited to explore them, but these are just hypotheses. So one is competition for resources like floral resources and nesting resources.
Oh, so by nesting resources, you mean that there may not, those twigs or pine cones, all those other kind of places where these bees are nesting, that they might just get, one species might just get there first to occupy them and the other ones can't.
Well, so if we were to think that competition between Osmia taurus and native species was the reason for the declines we observed, then we'd really want to look at what are the similarities? How do they share floral resources? What do they use similar nesting resources? For instance, Osmia lignaria, our native Osmia lignaria, Osmia lignaria is the most closely related to Osmia taurus and Osmia cornifrons.
Uh-huh.
And it uses similarly sized nesting cavities as the exotic species. And this native bee, Osmia ligneri, uses the same nesting partition material of mud, while the other native species use chewed leaves. And it also is one of only 2 native mason bee species that will emerge as early as the exotic Osmia cornifrons and Osmia taurus in our region.
Oh, so one way you could get at that question of like limiting nest resources is kind of like start to drill down and ask questions about, well, did this species have a similar niche to the exotic species? Because there you'd expect the impact to be most severe.
Yes, we would think that Osmia ligneri would have like the greatest potential among native species to really be impacted. But that's not really what we see in our results. We can't see any significant differences between how bad all of the native species are declining. They're all really bad, but there may be something else other than competition for food and nest resources that's driving this pattern we're seeing. So another possible mechanism could be that diseases from exotic mason bee species are spreading to native mason bee species. So usually when a bee species or any species is introduced, they're probably not coming by themselves. So they can have other associates that spread with them. And one of the main diseases really affecting the bee genus Osmia worldwide is chalk brood. And that's a group of fungi in the genus Ascosphaera. And several species of Ascosphaera, these fungi, are native to North America, but there were some researchers in Ithaca, New York, in Brian Danforth's lab that found exotic Osmia cornifrons was harboring a Japanese species of this fungi. And yeah, so one thing we're worried about in Virginia is perhaps these Japanese fungi are in our native mason bees now, and if they're pathogenic.
And right, so the cornifrons probably has some kind of resistance to it, and so it isn't as impacted with it when this disease spreads out, and so the other the native species don't have it, and they potentially may have a competitive advantage because of the pathogen.
That's a really interesting hypothesis, we think. However, there's still a lot to be explored there because some fungi in this Ascosphaera genus can be more saprophytic and not pathogenic. So it could be that
a saprophytic. It's just killing an already dead larva. It's not.
Saprophytic means it simply enjoys consuming resources from pollen in the nest or fecal matter in the nest or other things. So it's
not causing damage.
Right. Yeah. So and if it is, it's merely incidental. But we don't know. So we really want to explore that. And I've been working on that. And I'm excited to write that paper about exotic Ascosphaera and native mason bees in Virginia.
Okay, so we've got a competition for resources, both nesting and floral resources, and we've got the potential of a new pathogen coming in. Is there any other aspects that might be explaining these trends?
Yes, I also am curious that there may be, I think one reason Osmia cornifrons might have been selected for import into the U.S. instead of Osmia taurus was perhaps Osmia taurus experienced really high levels of natural enemy attack in Japan. However, if Osmia taurus was able to escape that enemy attack from its native range, and it has reduced pressure from enemies in West Virginia, then it may have really high reproductive output. It may be able to really ramp up its productivity in this new environment where there are fewer natural enemies for it.
It's fascinating. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Jim Kane once about alkali bees. And that he mentioned the reason why alkali bees can be propagated in such high numbers, it's really maybe the only ground nesting bee system that you could do that with, is because it really doesn't have any predators. And
That's great.
So the same thing may be happening here, where a species is sort of released into an environment and it really couldn't do well, but as soon as it's escaped its predators, it really explodes in number.
Yeah, that's another hypothesis we want to explore.
Interesting. Wow, what oh yeah, you got more?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Let's hear them.
I've been spitballing ideas all during the pandemic of how this pattern could happen. So one more is perhaps that they have that cornifrons and taurus have different climate preferences, and in fact, Osmia taurus seems to be doing really well in warmer climates, and it seems to be able to tolerate a wider variety of climate conditions than Osmia cornifrons. So we think that if it's able to do this, then it may be poised to spread much farther in its introduced range, particularly in warmer areas than Osmia cornifrons ever has been able to. But we still need to explore range expansions and shrinkages in our native and exotic Osmia species.
Well, this is great. I really like the way you set this all up, because I do think we hear, just coming back to your beginning with winners and losers and the mechanisms underlying them, these patterns can be visible, and it might be really easy to say, oh, it's just non-native bee and it's just a bully or something. But actually, the nuance of it may help figure out how you can do something about it. And I guess that brings me to my last question. Now, once you're in a situation like this, when you do have exotic bees that are loose, and we have several situations like this across the United States, but in particular with mason bees, where there is a trade of mason bees, what can be done, if anything? How can we deal with this situation now that it's occurred?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Anthony. And I think there is something that can be done. Companies that sell exotic Osmia cornifrons to farmers or to gardens or to folks who want mason bees in their backyard, these companies should really check that they're not accidentally shipping around the nearly identical looking, fast proliferating invasive Osmia taurus. Those species look basically similar to the naked eye, and it's best to tell them apart using a microscope. So if companies are going to sell these bees in the first place, then they need to make sure they're not spreading this invasive species. And I think there should be a little more stronger government restrictions or regulations on importing bees. And it's important, I think, to continue promoting wild bee monitoring schemes so we can track exotic and native bee species distributions and changes.
Okay, those are great suggestions. So just to recount them. So the one is that although cornifrons is out in a number of places, and it's not everywhere. The Nemoris is the one that we really, really want to be careful of, and I think the producers need to make sure that it's out of their stocks and have a way to weed it out. And then, But I also like what you said about part of that system of being able to know where those bees are and aren't. It kind of requires some kind of surveillance. Without the surveillance, you'll never know, and it won't give the producers any idea of whether the cat's out of the bag or not. Right.
Exactly.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's take a quick break. We have a series of questions we ask all our guests. I'm so curious what your answers are going to be. So let's take a break, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we ask all our guests these questions. First question is, do you have a pollinator book recommendation that you want people to know about?
Yes, Anthony, I do. So I found this gem of a book that is free to access online called Trap Nesting Wasps and Bees. And it has all their life histories. It has photos and plates of nest
Oh my
structures.
goodness.
It's by Carl Crombeen, and it was published in the 60s. And if you download the whole PDF, it's like 5 gigabytes. So but it's got really great photos, and I feel like I learned so much every time I pull it up.
So that is fascinating. I've never heard of this book, although I've heard the last name because of the mite.
Yes.
It's the mite guy. Okay, so tell us a little bit about. It just kind of it's interesting. It's not called cavity nesting bees and wasps. It's trap nesting. So this is based on sort of observations that you can make on it. Tell us a little bit more about the book.
Yeah. So this book really documents year to year what Carl Crombine caught in his trap nests, often around Plummer's Island near Washington, D.C. And it's a lot of year-to-year variations. He takes a beautifully detailed approach to documenting all of the enemies inside the nests, all of the types of bees and wasps that he found, like what days did they come out, if there was any. What I love is nest usurpation, or nest succession, where one mason bee might start making a nest, but another mason bee female takes over the nest, and it's of a different species. So he has these beautiful details of natural history about all of this nesting behaviors as well.
We had a previous episode with Ron Spendle, who's a master gardener in Washington County, and he has plexiglass topped nests and does a lot of very detailed observations. And I wonder if he doesn't know about this book, he'll be so excited. I'm gonna once we're done, I'm sending this directly to Ron.
Oh, great! His work sounds right up my alley. I've made some plexiglass nests as well. They're really awesome.
Well, the next question I have for you is, do you have a go-to tool for working with pollinators?
Yes. So the best tool I know that gets me through assembling thousands of nesting blocks or even identifying bees is a good Dolly Parton playlist. And it really gets me through. I think I'll share the public playlist. I made it public so anybody can, start identifying bees or, gardening or observing mason bees. And I recommend playing it on repeat. It's about an hour and a half, but it flows really well.
We are going to have a link to the Dolly Parton mason bee block observation Spotify playlist. This is the first recommendation. I'm really loving this interview. This is really great. Great job, Kate.
Great. You're welcome.
Okay, great. Well, you're really you're doing the unusual here. I don't think anybody's done anything. Your expectations are high for number 3, your favorite pollinator species. Take it away.
Yeah. So my favorite pollinator species is, guess what? A mason bee, and it's Osmia texana. Osmia texana has a really interesting distribution all over North America. And I went hunting with an undergraduate student named Dawson Little. We went hunting for this species in West Virginia one summer because it was rarely occurring at our field station, but we really wanted to go find it. And we were able to trap nest it, and we found it a lot on thistles. And we were able to make a pilgrimage to Sam Drogy's lab to take photos of this Osmia texana, one particular specimen that had a lot of thistle pollen and gummed up nectar on its body.
The image that you've sent, is this your image? It's there's a
yes. Sam Drogy took these stacked photos.
Great, and I can see the thistle pollen right there on the scopa.
Yeah,
and
it's really beautiful.
It looks like a little critter.
Yeah, this one is Osmia texana is about the same, a little smaller than Osmia lignaria, but I'd say somewhere around 8 to 9 millimeters long. So maybe the size of your last digit of like your pinky.
It's a beautiful bee. Well, we'll share the image on the link there, and
Oh, good.
You did great on these last questions. It was a great interview. Thanks so much for sharing information on your research. We're really looking forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for your time and for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.